Frédéric Armao,
Associate Professor at the University of Toulon,
and affiliated with the Laboratoire Babel,
specialist in Irish and British folklore and mythology,
focuses his research on Irish festivals and their role in shaping identity
within diasporas.
He has recently published Ishnar, the Centre of Ireland, with a preface by Irish President Michael D. Higgins. This book explores the symbolic importance of the Hill of Ishnar in County Westmeath in Irish history and identity. He has organized and co-organized several conferences on Celtic folklore, most recently Celtic myths and folklore in the English-speaking world in 2021.
He co-founded the YouTube channel Imaginaire Celtique together with Noemi Beck and Gael Healy, and will present his paper which examines children of the sea-divided Gaels, identity and remembrance on St. Patrick's Day in New Zealand.
Thank you very much. So my paper is entitled Children of the Sea-Divided Gaels, Identity and Remembrance on St. Patrick's Day in New Zealand. So you should all know what to expect, or at least you should all vaguely know what my paper is going to be about. I'll try to analyze the importance, the relevance, the history of St. Patrick's Day in New Zealand. And perhaps more importantly, I will try to underline its possible unique character in comparison to its many counterparts around the world. More specifically, perhaps in comparison to other places in the Pacific, mainly Australia. Now, I do specialize in the history of Ireland, so I am by no means an expert of New Zealand and its history. And the reason why I chose to focus on St. Patrick's Day in New Zealand and not in another country or place in the Pacific is that very few articles actually tackle this issue. And even the reference book on St. Patrick's Day, namely The Wearing of the Green, A History of St. Patrick's Day, never mentions New Zealand as far as I can tell. And it's quite surprising because it's actually an excellent book. So there you go. Because I'm such a naive person, my original intent was to go over the whole history of St. Patrick's Day in New Zealand from its introduction in the 19th century to today. And very quickly I realized that it was an impossible task, or at least it was impossible to summarize everything in 20 minutes or so. Therefore, I had to slightly narrow down my field of investigation, and I decided to focus on the beginning of the history of St. Patrick's Day in New Zealand, especially on the period starting in the 1850s up to the mid-1910s for reasons I will explain in a minute. And my intent was, once again, to understand, on the one hand, how unique, how special, how singular the celebrations of St. Patrick's Day were, or possibly weren't, in New Zealand. On the other hand, I wanted to know how political and religious these celebrations of St. Patrick's Day actually were in New Zealand, or if they were just mere cultural events. Spoiler alert, they were not only that. Now, before I start, I'd like to state the obvious and go back to the roots, the origins of St. Patrick's Day. Obviously, St. Patrick's Day celebrates St. Patrick, who is still today one of the two patron saints of Ireland, the other one being Bridget of Kildare. Although we do have traces of Patrick being recognized as the patron saint of Ireland as early as the 7th century, St. Patrick's Day was first recognized as the official Saint's Day of Patrick 1,000 years later, in 1607 precisely. Now, perhaps you should also know and remember that the actual St. Patrick was supposedly born in what would be modern-day England, and supposedly lived in the 5th century and died on March 17th, which still is St. Patrick's Day today. And he is credited with Christianizing at least parts of Ireland. However, you should also know and remember that very little is known about his actual life, and that a significant proportion of scholars tend to believe that there were actually 2 and possibly 3 different Patricks that Christianized Ireland. So in a nutshell, the official history of St. Patrick is clearly more about myth than it is about actual facts and history. Another important fact to bear in mind is that St. Patrick's Day began as a consensual, non-sectarian festival. In the 17th century, it was celebrated in Ireland by both Protestants and Catholics of all ranks of society, and the festival was supported by both churches. This did change, however, between 1695 and 1783 for several reasons. The festival was rejected by the Protestant institutions at the time. But after 1783, St. Patrick's Day became once again celebrated by both Catholics and Protestants, especially by the Irish Protestant ascendancy in Ireland. And it even grew in popularity in England, which later led to a religious dispute as to who owned St. Patrick. In the mid to late 19th century, when British/Irish migration to New Zealand actually started, both communities claimed Patrick as the precursor of their own communion. This is important to remember, not only because it is crucial to the history of both Ireland and St. Patrick's Day, but also because Irish migration to New Zealand was not a specifically Gaelic or Catholic phenomenon. What do I mean by that? Well, for those of you who are interested in the history of Ireland, you are aware that a significant portion of Irish people had to flee Ireland in the 19th century, mainly because of poverty and what is referred to as the Great Famine. Now, most of the people who left Ireland at the time did come from a Gaelic-speaking Catholic background and left Ireland precisely because they were poor and needed to find some new opportunities elsewhere. However, the real singularity of Irish migration to New Zealand was that, I quote, "On the whole, these migrants from rural Ireland to New Zealand were not the poorest of the agricultural community, nor were they refugees from the potato famine." I don't have time to read this very long, very interesting quote, but in a nutshell, migration from Ireland to New Zealand was as much a Catholic as it was a Protestant phenomenon. Also, it was as much rural as it wasn't, and it was not even exclusive to one specific social rank. Most importantly, perhaps, New Zealand immigration from Ireland was mainly an immigration by choice. This may explain the singularity of the traditions connected with St. Patrick's Day in New Zealand from the 1850s to the 1910s, which finally, without any further ado, I'm going to go over right now. All right. So first of all, when did the first celebrations of St. Patrick's Day take place in New Zealand? Probably in the 1860s, but possibly slightly before when, for example, in Australia, our first detailed accounts date back to the 1810s, where St. Patrick's Day had already become a euphemism for getting blindly drunk. And some sources even mention a full St. Patrick's week. Can you imagine that? Where people of all class would have fun and get drunk together for a whole week. Although, still in Australia, as early as the 1840s, the festival had already become more devout and less drunken. So back to New Zealand. How was St. Patrick's Day celebrated back then? Then, meaning in the 1860s. Well, first of all, the day was observed as some form of holiday, not a full official holiday, but let's say that most towns and cities recognized it at least as a partial holiday where, for example, government offices and banks were closed and shopkeepers were asked to do the same. For example, in Auckland, which was one of the main centers of Irish settlements in the 1850s and 1860s. Most of the first celebrations were targeted at kids and schools, especially Catholic schools, where picnics and masses were organized on St. Patrick's Day, and occasionally marches through the streets of the town or city. At first, those events were rather casual, but as time passed, they became more and more accepted and common and institutionalized, with about 400 children marching in the streets of Auckland in 1869, 5,000 in 1878, so not only kids this time, and about 10,000 in 1897, with thousands of spectators attending. So, for example, let's have a look at this account here, taken from a Catholic periodical called the New Zealand Tablet from the 29th of March 1878. I quote, "The anniversary of Ireland's patron saint was kept this year with unusual heartiness and vigor by the sons of the sod. Over 5,000 persons were present at the sports at the Domain and elsewhere. Nearly 300 children of the Catholic schools with friendly societies marched in procession with regalia and banners. His Excellency the Governor and Marchioness of Normanby honored the festive scene with their presence, as did also several members of the ministry. Not one case of intoxication or a single brawl marred the happiness and pleasure of the great concourse of people, and the pleasing spectacle was exhibited of a holiday being enjoyed and celebrated in a rational and pleasant manner. No one looking on the joyous crowd of well-dressed citizens, who on every hand might be convicted of the wearing of the green, could fail to see that Erin's sons and daughters in this new land of ours, enjoyed their fair share of the general prosperity, and had bade goodbye to that grinding poverty and lifelong struggle for existence, which unfortunately falls to the lot of many of her children in their dear old native land." So basically, joyous crowds of well-dressed citizens having a picnic, no significant intoxication, a festival celebrated in a rational manner. What a treat. I feel this extract is of particular relevance for several reasons. First, the connection between the old land of Ireland, suffering from, I quote, grinding poverty, and the prosperous new land of ours, quote unquote, is rather telling. For this informant, at least, St. Patrick's Day was about having fun, rejoicing oneself, and celebrating always in a new, thriving land. Second, the presence of His Excellency the Governor and his wife and members of the ministry shows how much this festival was accepted, institutionalized, non-sectarian, and inclusive. I'll come back to this point in a minute. Also here, I quote, "The wearing of the green is mentioned, and it was indeed an important part of the celebrations in New Zealand, which is by no means surprising." As it turns out, as early as the 17th century, St. Patrick's Day in Ireland was mainly about drinking, but also wearing green clothes, sometimes wearing so-called Celtic crosses, green ribbons, green hats adorned with shamrocks, and the use of shamrocks in St. Patrick's Day traditions is attested in Ireland as early as the 16th century. So two things that might be of relevance here. First of all, St. Patrick's used to be associated with the color blue in medieval times. Remember the picture I showed you earlier? That color that color was the common color used for St. Patrick at the time. St. Patrick's blue, it was called. But gradually in the 17th and 18th centuries, mainly for political reasons I might go back to if you have questions later, the color of Patrick went from blue to green. So technically, people should be, I guess, wearing blue clothes, and it should be the wearing of the blue. Second, the shamrock, or three-leaf clover, is associated with Patrick because, according to mythical tradition, Patrick used the three-leaf clover as a metaphor to explain the concept of the Holy Trinity to Irish pagans in the 5th century. But it is a late invention, probably dating back to the 17th century. So once again, myth. Anyway, so we do have plenty of detailed descriptions of those festivities in New Zealand. Here's another example, which I don't have time to read. So basically, it's about a picnic on St. Patrick's Day, with sandwiches and cakes and fruit and tea, wearing green clothes, a huge march and amusements, including sport. And as a matter of fact, sport seems to have played an important role in St. Patrick's Day celebrations in New Zealand, probably more than in Australia, and definitely more than in Ireland, where people in the second half of the 19th century had, well, other concerns. Those games and sports were likely inspired by Caledonian games, that is, Scottish games that were already common in Australia and New Zealand at the time. And as mentioned by Tanja Bultmann in her paper Remembering the Homeland, I quote, St. Patrick's Day sports served a similar purpose to Caledonian games as important public assertions of ethnic identity, while also securing respectability for the organizers in their respective local community settings. Here are a couple of interesting pictures of St. Patrick's Day celebrations in New Zealand that here combine both the theme of sport and that of the shamrock, with children arranged in the form of a shamrock at Newtown Park, Wellington. Same idea here, but in Auckland. And by the way, although those pictures date back to the early 20th century, I do feel like the spirit was basically unchanged compared to that of the 1860s or 70s. A couple more, just because, because they're interesting and relevant. There you go. That was the last one taken in Wellington in 1912. Now, I'm not there with you guys, but I still can feel that you are all a bit disappointed that all those St. Patrick's Day celebrations in late 19th century New Zealand were about wearing shamrocks, attending masses, and doing sports, rather than drinking oneself delirious. But there is actually an explanation. As early as 1873, most St. Patrick's Day celebrations in New Zealand were held under the auspices of the local branches of the Hibernian Australian Catholic Benefit Society, or HACBS, which implies that the celebrations were somehow controlled, managed, if you will, and politicized. Besides simply organizing picnics and masses or marches for children and the common people, the HACBS also held formal events such as dinners, banquets, or even concerts in Auckland, Wellington, or Christchurch, and stage plays and balls on St. Patrick's Days. And those events were held mainly for what might be referred to as the elite. When public processions were about displaying Irish identity and the belonging to a form of community, those exclusive events connected this Irish local community to New Zealand society as a whole. These events created a more private, elitist, and exclusively Irish setting, which provided a clearly defined space in which memory narratives could be produced, Buurtman tells us. Here is, for instance, an extract of a speech given at a formal dinner in Christchurch in 1892 by the chairman of the HACBS. I quote, St. Patrick's Day collects the children of the sea-divided Gael to express in joyous festivity their sentiments on the many happy memories connected with the dear old land. So the event was a way for the Irish elite to remember, to commemorate the past, as well as to celebrate in joyous festivity a more favorable and auspicious present. Now, as elitist and exclusive these events were, they were not as political and sectarian as one might have expected. In other words, although they were organized by the Hibernian Australian Catholic Benefit Society, they were not exclusively Catholic Irish events. Let's, for example, have a look at the toast proposed by a chairman in 1892. I quote, "The chairman now proposed the Pope, the Queen, and royal family, which were duly honored." Honoring the head of the Catholic Church and the head of the Anglican Church at the same time may seem surprising, but this toast is by no means an isolated occurrence. Occasionally, members of the Protestant elite, even English people or people of completely different backgrounds, attended those events. For example, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, who was an Englishman from Lancashire at the time, attended such an event, and as I already mentioned, occasionally governors and mayors were seen there. There are even examples of Maori people participating in such events in the early 1890s, as mentioned in this issue of the New Zealand Tablet in 1892. In any case, the main purpose of the church was to turn St. Patrick's Day into an open cultural event that would connect the Irish diaspora in New Zealand to New Zealand society. That would change in the 1910s and later because of the rise of nationalism in Ireland that will have an impact on the diaspora. But at the time in New Zealand, St. Patrick's Day was as much about expressing one's Irish identity, one's Irishness, as it was about connecting the children of the sea-divided Gaels to their new land. Once again, immigration to New Zealand from Ireland wasn't an exclusively Catholic rural phenomenon, and it was mainly an immigration by choice, which might explain the rather moderate and inclusive nature of most of the celebrations I've just mentioned. Of course, tensions did exist between Catholic and Protestant Irish communities in New Zealand, but they were not a defining feature of those communities at the time, and definitely not a defining feature of St. Patrick's Day in New Zealand. And now it's time for my concluding remarks. As might be expected, St. Patrick's Day in New Zealand was, well, a special day. It was about celebrating the rich history of Ireland, or perhaps more appropriately, celebrating the rich mythical figures and imagined narratives that had been created over the years in Ireland and transferring them into a new land. Arguably, the purpose was not so much about asserting one's Irish identity as it was to establish a link, a bridge, a connection between the old and the new land, between Ireland and New Zealand, and finding one's place in this new country that had welcomed the Irish, either Catholic or Protestant. The non-denominational quality of the dinners and balls held by the HACBS and the inclusiveness of most marches are rather peculiar and almost exclusive to New Zealand. As for example, in Australia, dinners had significantly higher levels of political tension, and I won't even be mentioning the situation in Ireland in the late 19th century and early 20th century in this regard. Celebrating St. Patrick's Day in New Zealand was as much a cultural event, a commemoration, as it was an act of integration and creation, that is, an acculturation phenomenon. The Irish used, replicated, and transferred their past, but adapted it to their new environment. Incidentally, this act enriched the Irish culture of the diaspora as well as it enriched the culture and traditions of their host country. As it turns out, St. Patrick's Day has now become an integral part of the culture and history of New Zealand, making the Pacific region arguably just a tiny bit more Celtic, I guess.
Thank you very much, Frédéric. So are there questions? Est-ce qu'il y a des questions? Alors, vous pouvez poser vos questions en français, en anglais. Nous avons un interprète, Robin, qui est avec nous. Sorry. So you can ask your questions in English or in French. They will be translated in the other language. Amaya, can you come? Vous pouvez venir, comme ça, il vous voit, Frédéric. Ah, pardon, Malcolm. So, Malcolm, would you like to start with a question?
I would. Thank you. And thank you for a wonderful and very interesting paper, Frédéric. I guess my question is around the role of the Catholic Church in dictating the terms of St. Patrick's Day. So while I think you're absolutely right to say it's a much more inclusive event than, say, in the United States, where you acknowledge that, the acknowledgement of the Anglican bishop and so on, how much is it that that's the Catholic Church determining the character more than really a cross-religion event?
You mean in New Zealand or as a whole?
Sorry, in New Zealand.
All right. Well, basically, the main involvement of the church at that time, I'm talking about the 1860s, 1780s, especially after the 1880s, was this society, the HACBS, which actually comes from Australia. And that's the actual involvement of the church to this regard. Of course, if you're talking about the Catholic Church as a whole and all people being a part of this Catholic Church, I'm guessing the priest played a large part in organizing events in Catholic schools, which is a different story, and that's how actually they managed the small children actually taking part in St. Patrick's Day. But I'm not sure I'm answering your question.
Yeah. No, that's great. Thank you. No, I think what you're saying is absolutely right. That's great. Thanks.
And what is peculiar about St. Patrick's Day in New Zealand is the involvement of different societies and the church, and the fact that at the same time both Catholic people and Protestant people of Irish descent wanted to actually celebrate St. Patrick's Day, which was the case in Ireland to some extent in different periods of times, but in New Zealand at the time, I think it was what is striking and peculiar.
Yeah. Do you have a question? Yeah. Fred?
Oui.
La connexion est vraiment pas très bonne.
Bah, super.
Je suis désolée, mais je pense que tu devrais couper la vidéo pour qu'on t'entende mieux.
D'accord, très bien.
Ouais, je suis désolée. On va voir si ça change quelque chose, mais... Non, bah tu... Ah, je vais juste... Ça, il faut pas.
So you mentioned that the official color of St. Patrick was changed from blue to green due to political reasons, and I was a bit curious about that. So could you please explain a bit more?
That's a great story, actually. There are several. You want me to answer the question in English? I can do it. No problem. Okay, so there are several reasons. Of course, as early as the 17th and 18th century, Ireland was the color green was associated with Ireland for, let's say, poetic reasons. The Emerald Isle, because of the landscape, I guess, which is, of course, an important part of it. But what really played an important role in the rise of the color green in Ireland, sorry, is basically the metaphor of a branch or a bough would grow, and that symbolizes freedom. And this idea of this branch growing, symbolizing nature, was actually actually comes from the French Revolution and all the ideas that stem from the French Revolution at the time. So the 18th century played a really important role, and the French Revolution played an important role as well in establishing this new color. And that's, by the way, why the current flag of Ireland, which is, as you know, a green, white, orange, is as it is today. It actually mirrors the French flag, using different colors. The color of orange, of course, for William of Orange, and the color green symbolizing the Gaelic Catholic parts, cultural parts of Ireland. And this color green was associated with Ireland first, and as a consequence, Patrick, because of this metaphor of a growing branch, growing tree, symbolizing freedom and liberty. And that's what it is actually. I think interesting. And gradually, the color blue faded in the minds of people, and it was replaced by the color green, and it was associated with Patrick year after year. I'm not sure you can hear me. Okay, good enough.
Is there another question? We've got time for a last question. On a le temps pour une dernière question, si vous souhaitez. No? Maya? You do have another question?
I don't know if it's not really relevant.
Yeah, it is always relevant if you want to ask a question. Go ahead. Yeah.
I don't know if I can. Okay, so I do have another question. It's about rather the history of Saint Patrick, especially about how it's affected pagans in Ireland. Because you did mention pagans and how Saint Patrick basically tried to convert them to Christianism, and so I was wondering what happened with them.
All right, that's a hard question. Do you have 2 or 3 hours? Okay, so first of all, we know that some person called Patrick actually existed in the 5th century. He actually wrote his life in Latin. We have different testimonies that prove that some person called Patrick existed and converted a part of parts of Ireland. However, what we do not know is the actual extent of his Christianization of Ireland. We know that he was there. He this person called Patrick writes that he converted thousands of pagans, but we don't know exactly how he did it, if it was an exaggeration, if it was real. The life of Patrick is almost an entire field of research. And I know researchers who spend their entire life trying to actually know how many Patricks there were, 2, 3, just one, what he did, how he converted pagans. But technically, what we should remember is that the Christianization of Ireland was a peaceful process. There were no martyrs. People were not killed to become Christians. Supposedly, it happened gradually over 2, 3 centuries, especially the 7th century is a key century. And some person called Patrick, let's assume that some person called Patrick started the whole process of Christianizing Ireland. So yeah, if you want to remember one word, pacific, peaceful. A peaceful Christianization of Ireland. That's how it happened. as far as we know and can tell.